The silence in the hospice room was deceptive. It wasn't an emptiness, an absence of sound. It was a dense, heavy substance that you could almost touch. It pressed on the eardrums, filled the lungs instead of air. This silence was woven from the barely audible, fated hiss of oxygen flowing from a clear tube at her nose, from the indifferent, methodical beep of the heart monitor that was counting down the last moments of her life with the precision of a metronome, and from my own ragged, choked breathing. I sat in the stiff vinyl chair that had, over the last 3 weeks, grown into me, become a part of my body, and I held her hand. Her skin, which I remembered as warm, smooth, and alive, was now thin as old parchment and cool, despite the warmth of my palms. I looked at Elizabeth, the woman with whom I had shared a life for 35 years, and realized with an agonizing pain that I hardly recognized her. Lung cancer, that invisible, merciless thief, had stolen her from me day by day, hour by hour, erasing her beloved features, leaving only a gaunt shell behind. She was only 58. I was 60. At this age, we were supposed to be arguing over the itinerary for a road trip through the national parks, not the details of her funeral. We were supposed to be bickering over the brushes and paints scattered around the house, not signing a do not resuscitate order. But all our plans, all our supposed twos, had crumbled to dust, turned to nothing. Elizabeth was an artist. Her reality was composed of colors, light, shadows, and textures. Mine, the reality of a structural engineer who built bridges, was made of numbers, blueprints, stress calculations, and grades of concrete. I connected riverbanks with steel and cement. She connected worlds on her canvases. Our home in Portland was a silent testament to our union, a strange but harmonious symbiosis of two universes. The stark, functional lines of the furniture I chose were submerged in the riot of her paintings, in the softness of chaotically scattered pillows, in the stacks of books on art, Eastern philosophy, and Buddhism. She was obsessed with Tibet. Having never been there, she seemed to know more about it than the locals. She could talk for hours, her eyes alight, about the pilgrimage, the Korah around the sacred Mount Kailash, about the crystalline purity of Lake Manasarovar, about the meaning of every symbol in a Buddhist mandala. I listened to her, but I didn't hear. I would nod, smile, but in my mind I was far away, in my projects, my calculations. I, a pragmatist to the bone, considered her passion a charming, harmless eccentricity. To me, mountains were just geological formations, the product of tectonic plate movement. To her, they were living beings, places of power. "Bill, you don't see," she would say, looking up from her easel, a smudge of cobalt on her cheek that made her look like an exotic bird. "You look, but you don't see. You see a rock, but I see the eternity frozen within it. There are answers in those mountains, answers to questions you're too afraid to even ask yourself." I would just wave it off. "Later, honey, we'll definitely go. When I retire, when the kids are fully on their feet, when we pay off the mortgage." An endless someday. I always thought we had an eternity ahead of us. What a blind, arrogant fool I was. Our children, long gone from the nest, experienced the approaching tragedy from a safe distance. Our daughter, Kate, a brilliant lawyer in Los Angeles, called every day. Her voice, usually so confident and commanding, would break, tremble. Her words were laced not only with pain, but with a poorly concealed rage, and I knew who it was directed at. "Dad, why didn't you insist she get a checkup sooner? You saw she'd been coughing for 6 months. Why did you let her put off seeing a doctor?" She was desperately looking for someone to blame, and I was the perfect candidate. Our son, Michael, a captain in the army stationed in Germany, was reserved and laconic. His calls were short, businesslike, full of clumsy male words of support. "Hang in there, Dad. Be strong for Mom." He was far away, protected by thousands of miles and the armor of military discipline. And I was here, at the epicenter, alone with our shared grief, which grew more tangible and suffocating with each passing day. On one of her last lucid days, when the morphine briefly loosened its icy grip, Elizabeth motioned for me to come closer. Her voice was as faint as the rustle of dry leaves in the wind. "Bring me my journal, the old leather one, in the top desk drawer." I found it, that worn, note-filled notebook that had been her constant companion. She took it with a visible effort, her fingers trembling. "Take it," she whispered, looking into my eyes so deeply it felt as if she were trying to pass something important to me, something that couldn't be contained in words. "Read it when I'm gone. And promise me, Bill, promise me, find peace in the mountains. Find it for both of us, where I couldn't." Those were her last meaningful words to me. 2 days later, a flat, merciless, deafening line on the heart monitor announced that her earthly journey was over, and mine was just beginning. The death of a loved one is not an explosion, it's an implosion. The world doesn't collapse around you, it collapses inside you, sucked into the black hole where your heart used to be. I returned to our house, which had ceased to be a home in an instant. It had become a museum of our life, where every exhibit screamed of her absence. Her unfinished canvas in the studio, where the morning mist over the Oregon coast was frozen in time. The mug with a dried-out chamomile tea bag on the bedside table, which she never got to finish. Her collection of Tibetan singing bowls, silent and cold. I walked from room to room, a ghost in my own past, and I was suffocated by guilt. A thick, sticky, all-pervading guilt. Guilt for every later, for every next year, for every honey, I'm too tired. I hadn't just not shared her dreams, I had devalued them with my pragmatism, and now that realization was burning me from the inside out. At the funeral, Kate couldn't hold it in any longer. In the crematorium parking lot, under the gray, weeping Portland sky, she exploded. "Do you even realize what you did? Her whole life she adjusted to you, to your plans, your career, your ambitions. She dreamed of the Himalayas, but all she saw were the walls of this damned house. You escaped into your work, Dad, and she escaped into her paintings. You lived in the same house, but in different universes. You let her dream die long before she did." Every word she spoke was the truth, a bitter, merciless truth from which there was no escape. Michael stood beside her, his eyes downcast, unable or unwilling to intervene. In that moment I felt absolutely, hopelessly alone, judged and sentenced by my own children. Weeks blurred into one endless gray, joyless day. I stopped answering calls, drew the curtains, and sank into a state of suspended animation. I would sit in her armchair, looking through old photo albums, trying to find that turning point when it all went wrong, when I stopped seeing her as a separate person with her own desires and began to see her as an integral, taken-for-granted part of my life. And then one day, mechanically sorting through her desk, I came across that journal again. I opened it with no real purpose, just to touch her thoughts one more time. Between the pages, filled with her flowing handwriting, there was a piece of paper, folded into quarters. It was a letter. "My dearest, my only Bill," she wrote. "If you are reading this, it means I have already embarked on my last great journey. Do not grieve for me. I lived a beautiful life because you were in it. But there is something I must tell you, a secret I will take with me. In these last weeks, when the pain subsided, I had the same dream over and over. I saw a tall Tibetan monk against the backdrop of a vast, dazzlingly white mountain. He didn't speak, but I knew he was calling me. He was showing me a path. I know how that sounds to you, my pragmatic, my earthbound engineer. A trick of the imagination, morphine-induced hallucinations. Perhaps. But to me it was more real than the walls of this hospital room. I didn't get to find out what awaits at the end of that path. So you find out, Bill. Not for me, for yourself. Look beyond the horizon. Find what I once lost in those mountains. Find peace. The moment I finished reading those lines, something inside me broke and simultaneously reassembled itself into some new, unfamiliar configuration. It was irrational, insane. But the words about the monk, about the call of the mountains, about a secret she took with her, merged with her last request. This was not just a letter. It was a last will and testament. It was a map pointing a way out of the ruins of my life. And I, a man who had built his entire reality on the laws of physics and structural engineering, made the most illogical, most insane decision of my life. I would go to Tibet. From that moment on, I began to act with a cold, detached methodicalness, as if executing someone else's precisely drafted project. The first thing I did was call a realtor. A week later, a for sale sign stood on our front lawn. I walked through the rooms where every day of our life together had unfolded and felt nothing but a burning impatience. I sold the furniture, donated her clothes to charity, gave my tools to the neighbors. I was shedding the ballast of the past, layer by layer, keeping only the bare essentials for survival. I sold my reliable, faithful car. From our entire past life, I kept only her journal, her letter, and one of her many amulets, a silver pendant with a finely engraved mandala, one she never took off. I hung it around my neck. Its cool weight on my skin was the only thing that felt real in this world that had lost its shape. A relentless war was raging inside me. My reason, my pragmatic engineer, screamed that I was going insane, that this was pure escapism, an attempt to run away from grief into an exotic setting, a costly and meaningless gesture. But another part of me, awakened by her letter, intuitively knew that this was the only way. I sat down at the computer. For hours on end, I read about Kathmandu, about Lhasa, about the pilgrimage to Kailash. The more I read, the more strongly I felt this irrational pull, as if an invisible thread was tugging me there, across continents and oceans, toward that very mountain from her dream. The day before I was due to leave, Kate showed up unannounced. She stood in the doorway of the empty house and looked at me with desperation and anger. "Dad, don't do this, please. This is madness. You can't just throw everything away and go to the other side of the world. We need you here. I need you." Her words were like red-hot needles, but for the first time in my life, I realized that right now, I needed myself more. "Kate, I have to," I replied, and my voice sounded surprisingly firm. "All my life, I've built bridges for others. It's time to build a bridge for myself, to get out of this abyss." She started to cry, called me selfish, and left, slamming the door. The next morning, with a single backpack containing the ruins of my former life, I boarded a plane bound for the other side of the world. Kathmandu hit me like a tidal wave. After the orderly, almost sterile green of Portland, this city was a living, breathing, screaming, stinking chaos. The narrow, dusty streets of the tourist district, Tamil, were packed to the brim. Cycle rickshaws with jingling bells, roaring motorcycles weaving through the dense crowd, sacred cows lazily chewing on cardboard boxes. The air was thick. You could cut it with a knife. It was a mixture of the sweet, intoxicating smoke of sandalwood incense wafting from hundreds of small temples and stupas, the sharp, spicy smell of curry and fried momo dumplings from street stalls, and the acrid stench of exhaust fumes from old, dilapidated cars. I, a 60-year-old American in my practical but utterly out-of-place trekking jacket, felt like more than just a stranger. I felt like a part from a completely different machine, accidentally dropped into this bubbling, chaotic cauldron. In the tiny office of the trekking agency, cluttered with maps and mountaineering gear, Dorje, my future guide, was waiting for me. He was a Nepali man of about 50, though his face could have been 70. It resembled a relief map of the Himalayas, etched with deep wrinkles from the merciless sun and icy wind. A thin white scar crossed his left cheek, giving him a rugged, almost piratical look. But his eyes were different. Dark, almost black. They looked not at you, but through you, and in their depths lay the tranquility and wisdom of the eternal snows. "William Carter," he said my name not as a question, but as a statement, as if checking against some internal list. "We have been waiting for you. The mountains have been waiting for you for a long time." This was no standard tourist pleasantry. His voice held such calm certainty, as if he were speaking of a long-arranged and inevitable appointment. His gaze drifted lower, settling on the mandala pendant around my neck, Elizabeth's pendant. I saw his pupils narrow for a fraction of a second. He said nothing, but I felt an invisible spark pass between us, a spark of recognition, of mystery, of something I had yet to understand. Our group was a strange collection of lost souls, drawn to the Himalayas like moths to a flame. There was Margaret, an Englishwoman in her 70s, with an aristocratic posture and an ineffable sadness in her clear blue eyes. She had brought a small copper vessel containing the ashes of her husband, Arthur, who had dreamed his whole life of seeing Everest, but never dared to leave his cozy garden in Kent. There was Jake, a 25-year-old vlogger from Ohio, with a permanent action camera bolted to his helmet and a habit of speaking as if he were constantly narrating a Hollywood blockbuster trailer. His goal was epic content that's gonna totally blow up YouTube. And there was a quiet couple from Mumbai, Arun and Priya. For them, this was not a trip, but a pilgrimage. Their faces were serene and focused, and they moved and spoke with a reverent slowness that contrasted sharply with Jake's hyperactivity. At our first dinner together, Dorje surveyed us with his piercing gaze and said, "Remember one thing. It is not you who go to the mountains. It is the mountains that let you in, or not, and they are the ones who decide which of you will make it to the end." Before setting out on the trail, we were sent for a mandatory medical checkup. A young Nepali doctor listened to my lungs for a long time through his stethoscope, frowning, then studied my EKG. "Mr. Carter, your blood pressure is borderline high. For your age and lack of acclimatization, ascending to such an altitude is a serious risk. Altitude sickness is a treacherous thing. It doesn't care about willpower, it cares about the condition of your blood vessels." His words were a bucket of cold water. What was I doing here? I, an office worker whose greatest physical feat in the last 20 years was assembling a bookcase from IKEA. My body was a traitor, a worn-out mechanism that could fail at any moment. The doubts I had so diligently pushed away returned with a new, suffocating force. In the gear shop, while buying thermal socks, I struck up a conversation with Margaret. With a surprising motherly insight, she sensed my state. "Feeling like an imposter, are we, Bill?" she asked, and there wasn't a hint of irony in her voice. Her directness disarmed me. And I, unexpectedly to myself, told her everything. About Elizabeth, her unfulfilled dream, her last letter, the guilt that was driving me here, to the roof of the world. I spoke, and the words I had held inside for so long came tumbling out, clumsy, painful, but real. Margaret listened without interrupting, just nodding occasionally, and in her eyes I saw not pity, but a deep, hard-won understanding. "My Arthur was the same," she said softly when I fell silent. "Always said tomorrow, and then one day his tomorrows simply ran out. You know, Bill, sometimes we set out on a journey for those we loved, but at the end of the path we find only ourselves. That night I had a disturbing, incredibly vivid dream. I saw Elizabeth. She was standing on the summit of a sun-drenched mountain, waving to me, smiling her warmest smile. I tried to walk towards her, but my legs were stuck in deep, heavy snow. I tried to call her name, but no sound came from my throat. And suddenly her face began to change, her features blurred, and then a completely different woman was looking at me, a woman with high cheekbones, slanted eyes, and long black hair. It was the face of a woman from an ancient Tibetan Thangka painting. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding. The image haunted me. It felt important, but I couldn't understand why. The flight to Lhasa was like jumping into another reality. We landed among barren, treeless, brown mountains, and the air here was different, thin, cold, and ringing like a taut string. Lhasa turned out to be a city of paradoxes. The majestic, otherworldly Potala Palace seemed to float above the bustle of modern, faceless Chinese buildings. Monks in maroon robes with prayer beads in their hands walked on the sidewalks next to Chinese soldiers in perfectly pressed uniforms whose silent presence created a constant, invisible tension. Ancient spirituality and modern occupation were intertwined here in a tight, painful knot. We went to the Yokhang Temple, the heart of Tibetan Buddhism. Inside, in the semi-darkness, thick with the pungent, tangy smell of melted yak butter and incense, I got lost in the labyrinth of chapels and prayer halls. Hundreds of pilgrims moved in a circle, murmuring mantras and spinning prayer wheels. And suddenly, I froze. On an ancient fresco, faded by time, depicting scenes from the life of a Buddhist saint, I saw it. A small, barely noticeable ornament in the corner, a pattern that was an exact, detailed copy of a drawing from Elizabeth's journal. She had sketched it in the margins next to an entry about a particularly vivid dream years ago. It couldn't be a coincidence. A cold, shocking thought pierced me. What if she had been here before? What if her whole obsession with Tibet was not just a dream, but a deeply buried memory? The tension in our motley group grew with each passing day. Jake, the vlogger, behaved like a bull in a china shop. He shamelessly filmed everything and everyone, shoving his camera in the faces of praying old men, trying to interview silent monks. His loud laughter and endless commentary for his camera felt like blasphemy in this sacred silence. Aaron, the Indian pilgrim, finally lost his patience. "This is a place of prayer, not a stage for your show. Show a little respect," he hissed at Jake after he tried to take a selfie in front of a statue of the Buddha. Jake just smirked arrogantly. "Relax, Grandpa. Everyone's got a job to do. I'm showing this beauty to the world." I tried to intervene, to reason with him, but was met with aggression. "And what about you, old man? Came here to atone for your sins? Don't tell me how to live. You should worry about yourself." I clenched my fists but said nothing. The seeds of discord had been sown and promised to yield a poisonous harvest. And then, finally, the trek to Kailash began. We left the last village with its dust and bustle behind and stepped into eternity. The landscapes were so grand, so otherworldly, that the mind refused to process them. Vast, stony valleys scoured by an icy wind that seemed to carry the voices of millennia. Lakes of such an unreal turquoise color that it looked as if the sky had dissolved in them. And above it all, the silent, overwhelming majesty of the Himalayas. The air became thin, as sharp as a knife's edge. Every breath was an effort, every step a small victory over my own body. My lungs burned as if filled with broken glass. My legs turned to lead weights. My head throbbed with a constant dull ache from the lack of oxygen. I walked on, stubbornly clutching Elizabeth's cool pendant in my hand. It was my only anchor in this harsh world, indifferent to human suffering. During one of our breaks, as we sat huddled together against the biting wind, Dorje began to tell a legend. His quiet, steady voice seemed to be a part of the wind itself. Kailash is not just a mountain, it is a living being. The guardian spirits of this mountain test everyone who dares to approach. They look into your soul, find your deepest fears, your oldest pain, your most secret guilt. They drag it all out and force you to look it in the face. If you are not ready, the mountain will not let you pass. It will break you. As he spoke, I looked at the gray scree on the slope of the mountain opposite us, and I thought I saw movement. A dark, shapeless shadow slid across the rocks, defying all laws of physics. I flinched. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice sounding too loud in the silence. Everyone turned. Nothing. "A trick of the light, old man," Jake said, not looking up from his smartphone. But Dorje was looking straight at me, and in his eyes I read, "They have begun. The test has begun." The rift in the group became inevitable. Jake, in his obsessive hunt for unique content, crossed the final line. He learned from one of the porters about a place where pilgrims were conducting a private ritual and secretly went there with his camera. When he was discovered, a terrible scandal erupted. For the Tibetans, this was the greatest insult and desecration. Aaron and Priya were furious. "We will not go on with this man. He carries bad energy with him. He defiles everything he touches," Aaron declared, his voice trembling with rage. They were ready to turn back. I tried to reconcile everyone, appealed to common sense, said we were a team. But my words were lost in the general noise of mutual resentment and cultural misunderstanding. Why was I here? To witness this ugly human drama against a backdrop of divine beauty? That evening, Margaret found me sitting alone on a rock, far from the camp. "Don't let his cynicism poison your journey, Bill," she said softly, sitting down beside me. "There are people who look at the stars and see only cold rocks and emptiness, and there are those who see a light that is millions of years old. My Arthur was one of the former. All his life he was afraid of looking foolish, afraid of his own dreams, and on his deathbed he wept. He wept for the dream he never dared to follow. You dared. That is already a victory, whether you reach the summit or not." Her wisdom, born of loss, was soothing and empowering, and Dorje's mystery deepened, becoming more unsettling. One day, when he stepped away to talk to the porters, I noticed that an old battered leather wallet had fallen out of his backpack. A photograph slipped out. I picked it up. In the time-faded picture, a young woman stood with long, fair hair braided down her back. She was laughing, and her smile, her eyes, her whole being were an exact copy of Elizabeth at 20. It was her, young, carefree, and she had been here. When Dorje returned, I handed him the photo. His face instantly became a stone mask. He snatched the picture from my hand so abruptly he almost tore it. "An old friend," he said curtly, and, without looking at me, put the wallet away. He clearly did not want to continue the conversation. but I already knew he was lying, and that lie was somehow connected to my wife. And then the mountains decided we had had enough psychological tests and moved on to the physical. We were walking along the bottom of a narrow gorge when the sky turned leaden in minutes. A snowstorm hit us with the fury of a predator. The wind howled like a wounded beast, knocking us off our feet, and icy pellets lashed our faces, turning the visible world into a roaring white chaos. In this whirlwind, I fell behind the group for a moment to adjust my hood, and that was enough. When I looked up, there was only a white curtain ahead. I was alone. Panic, cold and clammy like sweat, began to rise in my throat. I took a few blind steps, tripped on a rock hidden under the snow, and tumbled down a slope. A blow, darkness. My backpack was torn from my back and disappeared into the white gloom. I lay in a deep snowdrift, alone with the storm, without gear, without food. The cold seeped to my bones. I crawled under an overhanging rock, and in that icy hell my past returned to torment me. I was there again on that rain-slicked road many years ago, the screech of metal, the tinkle of shattering glass, silence, and Elizabeth pinned in the passenger seat, unconscious, my helplessness, my animal fear, my guilt. I didn't save her from injury then. I didn't protect her from her illness. I had been failing her my whole life. I began to drift off to sleep, surrendering to the treacherous, sweet warmth of a freezing man, and through the howl of the wind, at the edge of hearing, I heard my name. Dorje. He had found me. He was dragging me, wrapping me in a spare blanket. I was on the verge of losing consciousness, but I clearly saw him, before lifting me, take my pendant, Elizabeth's pendant, into his rough palms, bring it to his lips, and whisper a rapid guttural mantra over it. There was a strange, almost ritualistic intimacy in his actions. Several days later, exhausted and shaken, we finally reached the Dirapuk monastery. It clung to the very base of the north face of Kailash, which rose above us like the throne of a giant unseen deity. Ancient stone walls, wind-tattered prayer flags, the silent steps of monks, and the all-pervading smell of yak butter and incense. Here, in this oasis of tranquility, time seemed to have stopped. We were met by an old monk named Tenzin. His face was covered in such a dense network of wrinkles that it seemed the entire history of Tibet was written on it, but his eyes shone with a child's curiosity and incredible wisdom. He looked at me as if he had been expecting me. "You have come a long way," he said in surprisingly good English. "You came here for answers that the people in your world cannot give you. But the mountain does not give answers. It only shows you where to look for them, and you must look for them within yourself." In the evening, Tenzin invited me to a meditation in the main temple hall. I, an engineer, a man of numbers and facts, sat on a hard cushion and tried to clear my mind as he had taught. At first, my head was swarming with thoughts of the storm, of Jake, of Dorje, of the photograph. But gradually, the deep, monotonous chants of the monks began to work like a spell. My mind grew calm. And then I saw her, Elizabeth. She was not standing on a mountain, but on the shore of a vast, crystal-clear lake. She didn't speak, but with my whole being I knew what she wanted to tell me. She was calling me there, to that lake, to Lake Manasarova. When I opened my eyes, I was in turmoil. Was it a vision? A hallucination caused by altitude and stress? Or something more? I told Tenzin about it. He listened in silence and then said, "Then your journey is not yet over. You must go to the lake." "Your wife is waiting for you there." The path to the sacred lake Manasarova was different. The harsh, ascetic power of Kailash gave way to the serene, almost feminine beauty of the valley. And then a view opened up before us that took my breath away. A vast bowl of a lake filled with water of an unreal sapphire color. Its mirror-like surface reflected the snow-capped peaks and the slowly drifting clouds like a painting. The air here was filled with a sense of sanctity and peace. It was here that I began to understand that I wasn't seeking forgiveness from Elizabeth. She would have forgiven me anyway. I was seeking forgiveness from myself. Jake had left us. Unable to withstand the trials of the storm and his own demons, he announced he'd had enough of this wilderness and, joining a yak caravan, headed back to civilization. His departure, strangely, brought no relief, but it did unite us. We were smaller, but stronger. At the lake, I decided to take part in the ritual ablution. The water was icy, it burned the body but cleared the mind. I waded in up to my waist as the other pilgrims were doing and looked at my reflection. For a split second, it seemed I wasn't looking at myself. Looking back at me from the water was her. The same woman with Asian features from my dream, the woman from Dorje's photograph. I blinked, and the vision was gone. I scrambled out of the water, shivering from more than just the cold. Margaret, who was sitting on the shore, said she had seen her too. For a moment I thought I saw a young woman in traditional dress standing by the water. It could no longer be a coincidence. I told everything to Tenzin, who had arrived at the lake with several other monks. I told him about the fresco, the dreams, the vision in the water, Dorje's photograph. He listened with an impassive face, his fingers moving over his prayer beads. Sometimes souls are so strongly connected that their paths cross in more than one lifetime, he said enigmatically. Perhaps your wife was tied to this land long before she met you, in a past life. His words made my head spin. A past life? Reincarnation? For me, an engineer from Oregon, it sounded like complete nonsense. But what else could explain this entire chain of incredible coincidences? Returning to my tent, I took out Elizabeth's journal. I must have missed something. I began to reread it, page by page, and I found it. At the very end, on several pages, the text was different. It wasn't just entries, but some kind of code. Rows of numbers, single letters, small drawings. I hadn't paid them any attention before, thinking they were just sketches, but now I looked closer, and suddenly it hit me. It was a simple substitution cipher we had invented back in college to pass funny notes to each other during lectures. I grabbed a pencil and began to decipher. What I read shook me to my core. It was the story of her journey, a trip to Nepal and Tibet she had taken when she was 20, 4 years before we met. She had been a volunteer here, working in a small village. She wrote about the mountains, the people, the spiritual quest that had brought her here, and she wrote about the young guide who had helped her. His name was Dorje. And she also wrote about love, about a brief but brilliant, like a flash of lightning, romance with this guide, and about how she had left him her amulet as a keepsake when she left, and that a part of her soul had remained here forever, in these mountains. She had hidden this her entire life, not because she wanted to deceive me, but because it was another life of hers, a life before me. At that moment, Dorje entered the tent. He must have seen the light and came to check if everything was okay. He saw the open journal, the deciphered pages, and the expression on my face. And he understood everything. He sat down silently beside me. "I should have told you sooner," he said quietly, his voice full of sorrow. "Yes, I knew her. 38 years ago. She was like a bright star that had fallen into our quiet world. We called her Lamo, which means goddess. She left me an amulet and promised to return, but she never did. I searched for her, but I couldn't find her. And then, many years later, I received a tour application from a man named William Carter, and in the photo I saw the pendant around your neck that she had described as her most precious talisman. And I understood that the mountains were finally giving me an answer. I listened to him, and I felt no anger, no jealousy, only an endless, deafening astonishment and a kind of bright, piercing sadness. All my life I thought I knew everything about my wife, but it turned out she had a whole secret life, a universe she had hidden deep inside, and it didn't anger me. On the contrary, it made me see her in a new light, not just as a wife and mother, but as a brave, searching, passionate soul who had once fallen in love with these mountains and, perhaps, with the man who was a part of them. I realized that her dream to go to Tibet was not just a dream. It was a desire to return home. On the way back, as we were walking along a narrow path carved into the rock, disaster struck. A rumble came from above. A rockfall, huge boulders breaking free from the slope, came crashing down. Everyone scrambled towards the cliff face, pressing against it. Priya, the Indian pilgrim, stumbled and fell right on the path. A huge rock was hurtling straight for her. I didn't think. I just lunged forward, pushed her out of the way, and in the same instant felt a dull, tearing pain in my leg. I had been hit by a rock fragment. The pain was excruciating. I lay on the ground, my leg twisted at an unnatural angle. Dorje and Arun ran to me, trying to give first aid. I started to lose consciousness, and in that delirium, on the border between reality and nothingness, I saw Elizabeth again. She was sitting next to me on a rock, stroking my head, just as she always did when I was sick. "My silly man," she said with infinite tenderness, "you're still trying to save everyone. You saved her, Bill, and now save yourself. Live. Live for yourself. Let go of the guilt. I left because my time had come. Yours has not." Her voice was so clear, so real. I felt something inside me finally let go. The heavy stone of guilt that I had been carrying all these months, that had been crushing my soul, crumbled to dust. They carried me on a makeshift stretcher. It was agonizingly painful, but something had changed. Our small group, what was left of it, had bonded. Arun and Priya cared for me as if I were family. Margaret held my hand and told me stories about her Arthur. Dorje walked ahead, finding the safest path. In this shared misfortune, we had become a family. I understood that my guilt over Elizabeth's death was an illusion. The cancer was incurable. I had done everything I could. And her unfulfilled dreams, they were not my failure. They were her gift to me. She had left me a map that had led me here, forced me out of my shell, and sent me on the most important journey of my life, a journey to myself. As we passed by Kailash again, I asked Dorje to stop at a small stone altar where pilgrims leave offerings. I took the mandala pendant from my neck. I held it in my hand for a long time, feeling the warmth of the metal that had absorbed my body heat over all these months. And then I placed it on the stone. This was my ritual. I wasn't saying goodbye to Elizabeth. I was letting her go with love and gratitude. The moment I did it, high in the piercingly blue sky above the mountain's peak, I saw an eagle. It was soaring on the updrafts, its wings spread wide and free, and I felt that it was a sign from her. The return to Lhasa and then to Portland was like a slow awakening from a deep dream. The noise of the city no longer irritated me. It sounded like the music of life. I reconciled with Kate. I didn't make excuses. I just said, "I love you, honey," and I was wrong. "I'm sorry." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and then I heard her cry. "I love you too, Dad." Our family began to heal, to knit itself back together. I didn't buy a new house. I rented a small apartment overlooking the river. I started volunteering at the same hospice where Elizabeth had died. I sat with people, held their hands, listened to their stories, and I started to write a memoir about my journey, dedicated to Elizabeth. One day, I hung the Tibetan prayer flag Dorje had given me on my small balcony. The wind fluttered the colorful fabric printed with mantras. Looking at it, for the first time in many, many months, I felt an absolute, untroubled peace. My journey was over, and then, a few months later, I received a package. There was no return address, only a postmark from Nepal. Inside, wrapped in a silk scarf, was a photograph, an old black-and-white photo. It showed a young Elizabeth, laughing, happy. She was standing next to a young Tibetan monk. The monk looked very much like Tenzin, but the most astonishing thing was that he looked incredibly, eerily like me in my youth. Pinned to the photo was a note, written in calligraphic script. It contained only one sentence: "Souls always find their way to each other." I looked at the photograph and a smile touched my lips. Was it mysticism? An unbelievable coincidence? A trick of the imagination? I didn't know, and it didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was what I felt. A deep, unbreakable connection spanning across lifetimes to the woman I loved and to the mountains that had brought me back to life. And I knew that she would always be with me. In the rustle of the wind fluttering the prayer flag, in the reflection of the stars on the dark water of the river, in the quiet wisdom that had now taken up permanent residence in my soul.